Welcome back, everyone, and those joining online for session 7, new migrants and international students. We will hear from new migrants, refugees, and international students about the difficulties they face finding housing and their experience of stigma or prejudice in relation to the housing crisis. Each of the speakers will have 5 minutes to share opening remarks, followed by questions from the commissioners based on what you have shared in your submissions and here today. At the conclusion of this session, I will summarize what we have heard and draw it to a close. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge and thank all speakers for being here today. I also want to take the opportunity to remind our participants that some of the topics covered may be heavy and that we can take a break at any time. If you need to stop, step out of the room, or turn your camera off, please feel free to do so. So we have today with us, if I can find my speakers list, we've got Raf and Valentina. And online, I think, have we got someone online as well? Ashrika online. So Valentina, would you like to kick off?
Sure, thank you. I would like to begin by acknowledging everybody's home for providing us this space to share such valuable stories about the housing crisis affecting migrant workers and international students, but also affecting everyone in Australia, unfortunately. My name is Valentina Olivares. I am a Chilean migrant worker and a former international student. I came to Australia around 8 years ago. Similar to many migrant workers, I came inspired by a desire. There are many reasons for migration. It could be curiosity, personal and professional development, salary improvement, for fun, and in the worst case scenario, persecution, war, poverty. However, unlike centuries ago, the contemporary travelers and foreigners are not coming to Australia to take possession of the land or to steal what has been fought by local people. Like me, many migrant workers are here to contribute to the society. We are grateful to enjoy the comfort of a developed country with less crime than in our home countries and less sexual harassment towards women on the street. We feel somehow safe. But like many migrant workers and international students, I have suffered discrimination, job exploitation, wage theft, underpayment, and of course, I have been affected by the housing crisis. I have lived in overcrowded accommodations where abusive landlords or the person in charge to collect the rent and bonds didn't care about our living situation within the house. They impose rules, but without rights. You have nowhere to ask for help when there is no formal payment of your bond. As many international students and migrant workers, I am facing the highest cost of living and accommodation, particularly in Sydney. Unfortunately, international students are entitled to work a maximum of 20 hours per week. So the question is, how can you afford a 400 private bedroom per weekly, in a shared house or apartment with that restriction? We have to be realistic. In many cases, international student and migrant workers are just earning the minimum salary, which is $23 per hour. And numbers don't lie. You can make a simple math calculation. If the cost of, as I mentioned, the private bedroom costs you around $400 per week in Sydney, plus the fees that we have to pay for expensive college or English or general English course, which can cost you around $1,000 monthly, plus the bad quality of the private insurance that you have to pay, which just covers sometimes the GP. The public transport as well can cost a fortune for international students, as we are not entitled to have a travel concession card in New South Wales. Despite the hardship, migrant workers and international students has been recently blamed by Peter Dutton in the media for the housing crisis. We are blamed for the lack of skills from people in power to provide decent and affordable housing in Australia. In spite of the massive contribution to the Australian revenue, according to the Department made by international student and migrant workers, according to the Department of Education, for the financial year last year in 2022 and 2023, international education was worth 36 billion to the Australian economy. There was 21 billion paid as goods and service and 14 billion paid as tuition fees. However, temporary visa holders, like international students working on holidays, are not entitled to a job seeker or Medicare. During the pandemic, we were totally unprotected. We were not entitled to get job seeker, we were not entitled to get job keeper, and on top of everything, Scott Morrison say us, if you cannot afford the cost of living, go back home. Just in 2021, when the government was desperate trying to retain some migrant workers in the country, and they saw the crisis left by many migrant workers who went back home, they decided to provide a financial support, a type of job keeper for international students and migrant workers, just in 2021. This is because the Australian government realized how important is our contribution to the Australian economy. However, we are still treated as second-class citizens, particularly when English is your second language. So I would like to just ask the politicians or the community to think, what would happen if migrant workers decide to don't attend their jobs just for 1 day? 1 day of strike or walk off from migrant workers. What would happen if we don't have the waiters and waitresses? Without your baristas, without your early childhood educators, without laborers, cleaners, without the valuable job of babysitters. So I would like to think, what can happen in this society without that important working force? Not just because we are a big contribution, a massive contribution to the Australian revenue, and as a working force, we have been very important for this country, but also because migration is a human right. So that is what I would like to expose.
Well, thank you, Valentina. Raf, how about we hear from you?
Thank you. Mabuhay. My name is Raf Reyes. I live in what the Daily Telegraph has described as the smallest apartment in Sydney, and you can quote me on that. Not too far from here, actually, in Camperdown along Parramatta Road. For me, though, it is 12 square meters of heaven. And even though it is only as big as a car park, it has made me feel secure in the toughest of times. It has been almost 5 years since I moved in, which makes it about 5 years since I started out as an international student from Manila in the Philippines in search of a better and more stable life here. I studied actually here in the University of Sydney, and actually my second year coincided with what was then the first COVID lockdown in 2020. It was very tough living alone, couldn't find a job, and barely surviving. And it was also a heap of firsts. My first time away from home for a long time, my first time going without food, because in order to scrape enough money out of my savings to afford rent, I resorted to cut my budget in other places. And the longest time of which I didn't eat was about 29 days on just water. It was also the first time I sought medical attention for mental health issues, which was a futile effort considering I couldn't afford the specialist. I'm on a temporary visa now, and I work in the not-for-profit health space, which is only possible, if I could say, because where I live now would technically be classified as affordable housing. But at the time I was struggling, I was and still am grateful for having a place I can call home in Sydney. And even though it takes me an hour and a half to get to where I work from Canberra down to the hills, I know I'm not getting anything better rent-wise. I've tried. Just recently, I applied for affordable housing in the inner west and was flatly rejected. But I am eternally grateful for having been able to stay. Many of my colleagues, international students themselves, chose to go home, even being told to actually go home by the Prime Minister at the time. I am also grateful to have had the opportunity to be part of what was then the Oz International Students Hub, of which Ashrika Online and Valentina was also part of, the first grassroots-led international students project in New South Wales. I was able to, in that capacity, to listen to stories of so many international students and temporary migrants, of which I can hopefully share today. Because unfortunately, many of the stories we heard then are still happening now. Students from South Asian countries who contend with sleeping in shifts as 3 to 4 people try to fit in one room. Some students from China and Vietnam cannot afford rent, and so they resort to paying off their landlords by working for them in different capacity. And I'm sad to say that many of these landlords are from the same countries as these students. But what I find so appalling is the narrative that migrants and international students, which, if I may say so, have brought on a rich diversity and knowledge and skills to this country, are now being scapegoated as the cause for the housing crisis. International students who, if I may say so alone, have brought in about 36.4 billion to this economy in the last year. Let me end by saying that I do not have ready suggestions to solve this crisis. Who am I to solve it, considering that I'm only a resident for tax purposes? But I'd like to reiterate what many others have been calling for. One is to increase supply, but not just supply, affordable housing supply, and unlocking that supply, may it be through planning pathways or better processes. But I'd like to take it a step further and make that affordable housing supply accessible to everyone residing in Australia, may it be citizens or permanent residents or migrants, and international students for that matter. 2 is a bit out there, but I'd like to suggest an overhaul of the visa system. Well, I don't want to suggest it, but everybody has been suggesting it. As Democracy in Color, another organization, has been saying, migrants are stuck in holding patterns without access to permanent residency or essential services and being exploited by their employers of their visa status. And so in the past year or so, the government has promised an overhaul, and they've made some changes, don't get me wrong, but inherently the system, the visa system, is still unjust. And people still fear speaking out about these injustices, as you know how very few have come forward today to speak about their experiences. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Raf. And we have Ashrika online, I think.
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, amazing. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this critical juncture. I am Ashrika Parathi and I'm an international student leader here in New South Wales. Even more so, just as Raf highlighted his experience of the pandemic, and Valentina did the same as well. I would like to shed some light on my experience during the pandemic as well. So I was one of the few lucky students who was able to catch a flight back home before things started getting worse during the pandemic in Australia. So I completed approximately 2.5 years of my study here at the University of Sydney again, online as an offshore student. And I worked with Ross and Valentina in the Aussie International Students Hub, where we shared stories and we got to hear a lot from other students who were offshore as well. Even more than that, I feel during the pandemic, when I was going back home, I was not in a position to even understand what was going on. And I just had to fly back home at the time. And when I did that, I was actually forced to pay rent for 6 months, even though I was not staying in my student accommodation in Sydney anymore. So I ended up paying the rent for 6 months. Then, of course, during the pandemic, things were pretty bad. Borders were closed. I could not come back. I actually delayed coming back even when the borders reopened because the housing situation was so precarious. And all of my peers were telling me that it's so difficult to find student accommodation. You might want to plan ahead if you're planning to come back and study onshore. So I ended up coming back in the second semester of my third year, which was in 2022, the July of 2022. Apart from that, having worked with international students over 4 years at university, I've just recently graduated. And also having worked in the international education industry, I've been able to gain a lot of insights as to how everything needs to be reframed when it comes to the housing crisis and how international students are being taken to play a role in that. Indeed, the housing crisis in Australia has reached a point where it no longer affects just one segment of the population, it affects all of us. However, international students, as we've all heard, are particularly vulnerable. Despite making up only 4% of Australia's rental market, as highlighted by the latest Student Accommodation Council report, we often find ourselves scapegoated for the broader crisis. This misplaced blame is not only unjust, but also diverts attention from the systemic issues that need urgent resolution. Us international students face numerous challenges when we seek housing. One of the most significant obstacles is affordability, of course. The cost of rent in major cities like Sydney has skyrocketed, making it increasingly difficult for us to find accommodation within our budget. Many of us come from countries with lower living costs. I myself come from India, where, as the media has deemed it, luxury is cheap. And the sudden financial burden is overwhelming. Moreover, we often face higher rent prices compared to local students due to perceived vulnerabilities and lack of local rental history. Safety is another concern. In the pursuit of affordable housing, many of us end up in substandard living conditions, as Valentina just highlighted. Overcrowded apartments, poorly maintained buildings, and unsafe neighborhoods are far too common. This not only affects our physical well-being, but also our mental health and academic performance. Finding suitable housing is further complicated by visa-related restrictions. The ability to secure part-time and even full-time employment is often hindered by visa limitations, which in turn affects our financial stability and our capacity to afford decent housing. Many landlords are reluctant to rent to students with uncertain financial situations, perpetuating a cycle of housing insecurity. Recently, the government increased the financial capacity proof requirement for international students from $21,041 in October 2023 to $29,710 this month. While this change might be beneficial for prospective students by ensuring they have adequate funds before arriving, it is a mere band-aid solution for current students and recent graduates such as myself, who are already struggling to make ends meet under existing financial pressures. To address these issues, several changes are urgently needed. Number one would be increasing affordable housing supply, of course. The government must invest in and incentivize the construction of affordable housing, specifically targeted at students. This includes expanding purpose-built student accommodation, which offers safe and suitable living conditions to students. Rental assistance programs can also be implemented, targeting financial assistance programs for international students, which can alleviate the burden of high rent. Subsidies or grants could make a significant difference in enabling students to afford better housing. Regulation of rental practices would also be something that would provide us relief. Stricter regulations and oversight are needed to prevent exploitation in the rental market. This includes measures to control rent increases and enforce standards for safe and habitable living conditions. Of course, establishing robust support services that assist international students in navigating the rental market, or even just redirecting them to pre-existing hubs, such as the Aussie International Student Hub or the Redfern Legal Center here in Sydney, is imperative so that students can understand their rights and access legal support when it is crucial. And most importantly, we need to work towards enabling social licensing. We need to bridge the gap between international students and the Australian community. Social licensing initiatives can highlight the plight of international students and foster understanding and empathy. By promoting positive stories and contributions of international students through media and community programs, we can combat prejudice and build a more inclusive community. Blaming international students for the housing crisis is not only unfounded, but counterproductive. We are here to contribute to Australia's multicultural fabric and economy. Yet we find ourselves struggling to make ends meet due to pre-existing challenges that are beyond our control. Thank you for your time and attention, everyone. I hope together we can work towards a solution that ensures safe, affordable, and suitable housing for international students in Australia.
Thank you, Ashrika, Raf, and Valentina. Now, Nicole will ask some questions.
Yes. Let me add my vote of thanks, Raf, Valentina, and Ashrika. Look, I'd just like to kick off actually by asking you and any one of the three of you, because I understand you're all from the same organisation. I didn't quite catch the title, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more about your organisation and what it is doing in relation to housing and the insights that that's afforded you.
Thank you, Nicole. Well, we used to volunteer, and we did not plan to be here at the same time. I just saw Valentina rock up today and Ashrika the other week, and so did not plan this at all. But the organization is named as Oz International Students Hub. It's currently inactive, by the way, but it used to gather, listen to international students' experiences in Australia, and actually tailor a couple of programs towards international students. So there used to be a mental health initiative within that. There used to be funding from the New South Wales government towards an intake assessment and referral service, which was auspiced by another organization called the City Community Forum. And so that organization has now been inactive for quite some time. As you may know, international students do not have the luxury of time to organize within ourselves. And so people will be hesitant to actually do that work, but it was important, and I think it still is.
Yeah, and I would like to include that us international student hub was born during the pandemic, during 2020, when international students were facing the crisis about unemployment. We didn't have accommodation, and we were told to leave the country. So we found this space online by Zoom, provided by different organizations, but mainly by Sydney Alliance. Sydney Alliance was the organization who promoted and allowed us to connect among each other.
Thank you.
And just to add on to that, I'm sorry, was I cutting someone off?
No, I was actually going to go to you, Ashrika. Are you still studying, by the way?
No, I actually just graduated from the University of Sydney. My ceremony is on Monday.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank
but
you
yes,
very
you were
much.
going to add something about this organization.
Yes, so as Raf mentioned, it was born during the pandemic. And the main objective of the organization and a couple of initiatives that we undertook, like the mental health initiatives and even listening events that we used to have over Zoom, was to give each and every student who was, studying at an Australian university, but they were forced to stay offshore or go back offshore, and they were missing that sense of community. And also, there was no outlet for catharsis for these students, because a lot of these students came from countries where mental health was a big stigma and they could not access mental health support services. So just, group listening and talking sessions wherein they could share what they're going through, their experiences, that was sort of cathartic for them and gave them a sense of community that, okay, even when we staying in our home countries, we have a community back in Australia that we can look forward to going back to, because they lost a sense of community during the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
Add on to that. Thank you very much, Ashrika and Valentina. I think to be so forthcoming, the beauty of, we call it OISH, by the way, because that's the acronym, OISH. The beauty of OISH was that it was targeted to vulnerable international students from colleges and vet institutions, right? So we did come from the University of Sydney, I believe, Valentina, but a lot of the people who were involved in OISH were from those small colleges, were really vulnerable to being exploited. And so I was going to say that the current focus of the government, unfortunately, has shifted. It used to support OISH, but because the government would like international students from more, I would say, prosperous backgrounds, people from disadvantaged backgrounds who would go to smaller colleges are now discouraged, I would say.
From coming to Australia.
From coming to Australia.
Right. And so the support had been provided by the New South Wales state government.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Let's you look. The three of you have put so many important things on the table. I'm probably only going to be able to skate over some of them, but I'd like to pick up the issue of rental discrimination, actually, because it that's come up repeatedly. I wonder, Ashrika, Valentina, or Raf, if any of you would like to talk about your experiences as an international student or migrant in navigating the private rental sector.
I would like to recall my current situation, but also the time when I decided to be more independent in this country. Because I was experiencing a coercive relationship in the past. I was living with a partner, an Australian partner. So then I decided to move by myself, and I found out quite difficult to apply for accommodation with my current income. So at the end, I was forced to live in shared houses or apartment, but it gave me the opportunity to be independent and safe again, which is important. So it was a cost at the end. The cost was high, but it's still worth it. And unfortunately, of course, the housing crisis is stopping me to afford a private space and more quiet space to live. So we have to navigate different issues, trying to find the proper flatmate, trying to find the proper location to don't be too away from our networks, from work, from our close friends. Because my family is they are in Chile, I don't have emotional support apart from my friends and close people. They are the people who are supporting me every day. So we try to live close from each other, and being a migrant woman with low income, no enough to afford the housing crisis, and what the market is offering at the moment is quite difficult.
Thank you, Valentina. And Rafa or Ashrika, did either of you encounter any, overt or subtle, or hear about as a result of your work with the student organisation?
I was going to say, I did not experience any just because by choice I have not moved at all. But I have tried, don't get me wrong, Nicole, because I've been trying to find other accommodation that is affordable in Sydney. But unfortunately, everybody who's offering affordable housing, especially affordable housing CHPs, have it listed directly that they're only for citizens in permanent residence. But I'm also in small groups on Facebook offering sublets or housing. And so I'm still on the lookout, but it's not going to be an easy task to find housing that can fit the budget. I want to reiterate what Valentina has said as well, that migrants, especially those of the same nationality or background or country, they tend to flock through the same locality. A lot of Filipinos are in Blacktown, in Duneside, and the Ruti Hill area in the west. And so you'd see a lot of pockets around the west and the south area of Sydney of other countries. And so I just want to reiterate how hard it is for other people to travel, especially if work is in another place. I, for one, work, it's quite weird, right? I work in the West, but I actually live here. But others have the flip side, right, of working in the city or working close by, but having to travel about an hour and a half away.
Ashrika, sorry, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I think I've had a similar experience to Raf. Since I've been back, I've been living in a student accommodation, and I have chosen not to move out by choice, mainly because number one, the leases are not flexible, so it's a headache finding a house if you're already ending one of your lease and then you're not able to find a new house to live in within a given time frame, you would be rendered homeless. I also do not have any familial support here. My family is in India. I don't have any close relatives or any family friends here. So it's just my friends and colleagues that I worked with over the past 4 years. And I feel it's also the fact that as an international student, even if you decide to live in a private accommodation in your first year, or even after coming back after the pandemic, you don't have any rental history. So they also use that against you. A lot of landlords increase the rent because you don't have any rental history, and you don't have any pay slips either, because of course, how would you have worked if you're just coming back after the pandemic? So it's like an endless cycle. You're stuck in a loop if you're living in a student accommodation. And student accommodations, it's something that should be noted, are also very dingy, but you pay a lot of money to live in those dingy rooms. It's not exactly something that contributes to our mental health. A lot of my friends and even myself during university, we would work a lot. We would do multiple jobs just because we didn't want to come back home because it felt like the walls were closing in on us. So I feel for the price that we pay, the homes that we're getting are really not worth it. That is also something we need to take into account when we talk about private properties, because a lot of international students don't feel safe enough to rent outside of student accommodations. And we've already discussed the reasons. But even those student accommodations, they're not great.
I actually would like to talk about both of those two things that have been raised. One is the cost, the availability, the quality, the design of the existing student accommodation, whether it's purpose-built or whether, you know, it's being offered in some other arrangement. And then the other avenue I'd really like to explore with you both is this informal sort of share arrangements that you've described, particularly you, Valentina, and the personal risks that you've described of feeling unsafe in the housing, but also feeling unable to raise problems with your landlord, in part because of the additional level of insecurity that your informal lease arrangement and you know, lack of bond records and things like that is sort of putting you in. So with those two signals on the table, maybe we can ask you, Valentina, to talk first about that experience. If I've understood it correctly, it seems to be the informal share accommodation sector, which is where you're living at the moment.
It was, that situation happened in 2016 when I started living in Australia. I found this shared flat in the city. So I shared my bedroom and also I shared the rest of the house, the rest of the flat. We were in total 7 people in that space. It was 3 bedrooms and plus the balcony, which was converted into a bedroom. So we didn't have fresh air in the living room because the balcony was locked. It was a bedroom. Someone was sleeping there. And that poor guy was very cold at winter because it was a balcony full of glasses. So poor guy. So anyway, and then my shared bedroom was very tiny and expensive. I was paying more than $200 per week, around $250 per week to share my bedroom in 2016. We were sharing the bathroom with 4 other people. And I wanted to move one of the desks in my bedroom because I didn't have a space for my luggage. So I sent an email with my broken English because it was my first year. My English was 0 when I came to Australia. That was the purpose of my visit to Australia, to move here to learn some English, because in Chile I couldn't do it. And he just ignored me. He said, no, you cannot move any furniture from your bedroom or you have to pay a fine. It is $50, and if you move the furniture, and then you have to return the desk to your bedroom anyway. So I wasn't allowed to move anything. And then I spoke with my flatmate, and they agreed. They say, okay, you can move it. This is a common area, but the desk is no problem in the living room or wherever you find a spot. And I did it. So then the landlord, when he visited the house whenever he wanted, because he just jumped in and he visited the house to do anything. We didn't really know when he was around. He had the key to do whatever he wanted, and I was charged $100 instead of $50. And he said, because I broke the rules and I didn't respect what he says. I tried to explain that it wasn't bothering anyone at the house, but I was forced to pay the $100, so I have to leave the house. And I felt powerless because I have nowhere to go. My English was terrible. My focus was to find a job, to be focused at work, to go to the college to learn some English. So it was too many things on my plate to continue fighting with that abusive person in charge of the house. And then I just try to follow the rule, pay the $100 for the fine, and to continue living with what I have in my hands. And now in the present, my situation has been improving because now I am sharing my space with less people, and I am lucky and I am privileged to have my private bedroom, which is more privacy, but it is still very expensive. So at the moment, I am spending more than 50% of my rent, my income in accommodation.
In a shared
To have in a shared home, but with private room, and I am spending at the moment more than 50% of my income. So which is very stressful.
Absolutely, it far exceeds the definition of housing stress. Valentina, can I ask, is your current shared house arranged by, like, organised by one of the tenants? Are they the head? Have they got a head lease, and are you all named tenants on the lease, or is it organised by someone else who you pay rent to?
We have the lucky opportunity, the opportunity to get the lease. So we are sharing the lease, and it was, it has been much more fair because we know where is the bond. Everything has been done in a legal way and very clear. So even when the accommodation is very expensive right now, and I think the amount is abusive. The amount that we are paying is abusive because it is very expensive. But at least I can have my privacy.
Thank you. I can see Raf wants to say something.
Yeah, we are sharing the lease right now because it has been an arrangement with the landlord.
Thank you. And so Ashrika and/or Raf, if we can move to the question of student accommodation. Ashrika, is your accommodation, it's student accommodation, is it purpose-built, managed by one of the student housing providers?
Yes, it is a purpose-built student accommodation. I think I would also like to talk about my experience in 2020 when I initially came to Australia. I was living in an 8-person apartment in a twin sharing arrangement, and the rent was more than $400 a week, which at the time seemed like a lot. And the room was pretty small. I think it was 12 square meters by 12 square meters. I'm not sure. But the bathroom was also in there, and I was sharing with another person. So the room was pretty small. And when I arrived there, it was not exactly clean. So in the 8-person apartment, the common area was extremely dirty. The bins were full of fruit flies. And it got so bad that in the end, we actually ended up throwing the bins outside because they would just not clean it. There was not enough staff to make sure that each and every room was cleanly maintained. And, there was like a hygiene maintenance of each and every apartment. Number two, I was lucky enough.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'd just like to clarify something, if I may. So that apartment was being managed by a student housing provider?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And was your access facilitated by the university or had you organised that yourself?
I organised that myself.
Sorry,
the university does have resources on that. They have like a common page wherein you can see each and every private student accommodation that's available, how you can rent out private properties in Australia. But that's mainly just like a refresher on how you can do it. There is no service that really connects you to private housing or private student accommodations here. So you have to arrange that yourself. So yeah, and I was lucky enough to have a really good roommate, but there were people who had abusive roommates who would control each and every movement. And my neighbor, the person who was living right next to me, she used to cry each and every night that it's horrible. How do I do this? So when I came back to Australia after the pandemic, and I paid 6 months rent for that place. because they would not let me end the lease, even during the pandemic. So I was in India and I was paying the rent for that place. And then when I came back to Sydney in 2022, I decided that I just cannot deal with that, because what if I get an abusive roommate in a student accommodation? And I ended up taking a studio apartment for myself, but that was extremely out of pocket. And of course, I was forced to take the help of my parents to, help me lease out that place. And ever since I've been living here, the rent has been increased by more than $150. So from 2022 till now, the rent has been increased for more than $150. I was so scared that they're going to further increase the rent this time. So I just took a 1-year lease extension this time. So the rate keeps on getting locked in, even though I'm not sure if I want to stay in Australia or not, because I've graduated. So that is another problem. You cannot end your lease flexibly, even if you're not staying here. You need to rent it out to someone else. And then there is a fee for transfer as well, transfer of lease. So it's extremely unaffordable. And like Valentina, I was working in the international education sector not long ago. I decided to pursue something else, so I left the job. But when I was working, I was also spending more than 50% of my income on the rent. So yeah, it's been a big headache just trying to figure out things as a recent graduate, because if I continue staying in here, the cost of living is so high that I will not have the liberty to figure out what I want to do in my career. So I'm actually thinking of going back home, figuring things out, and when I have a plan of action, then coming back.
So, Ashrika, just so that we are abundantly clear, you're describing a purpose-built student accommodation sector, which is not providing you a particularly high-quality unit. You've used the terminology dingy. You have not had any protections against sudden rent increases. The rent is so high that it is more than 50% of your income, even though you are now presumably working more than the 20 hours per week that you're entitled to work as an when you're a student.
So I'm now on my temporary graduate arrangement. I'm on my bridging visa now. So I'm not exactly under those restrictions anymore. I can work for more than the prescribed limit.
And yet the accommodation is more than 50% of your income.
Yes. The current accommodation, I would not describe it as dingy. It's much better than the one I had in 2020. But then again, you can't say it's the size of a normal studio apartment. It's not dingy, but it's not that huge either. Okay. And for the price that I'm paying, it's just too much.
Okay. Okay. And we've also heard you explain how absolutely inflexible the rental arrangements are as well. So if I can ask the three of you, the big ticket item that's been put on the table, and noting that the three of you have explained that rather than being the causes of the housing crisis, particularly given the tiny amount of residential space that the three of you appear to have been occupying, far from being the causes, you appear to have you're certainly painting a picture of international students as being victims of, I think, invalid.
Reading my note.
Oh, sorry. I must stop editorializing. It's a real problem, especially when you get students in front of you. Academics, it's a occupational hazard. So I'll zip it. But I wanted to ask our three experts in the room on international housing what you think about the idea of asking universities to take more of a, responsibility in the international student housing space, and or is the purpose-built student housing, is that the answer? If so, how would it need to be arranged?
Can I just say that when I heard that tidbit on the news that in order for universities to increase international student intake, they'd have to provide housing for them. It sounds like a nice idea at first, but it's, to use a term I would not use, it would be ludicrous just because, Ashika, I don't know how you're affording to live in student housing. It's not at all affordable. University villages in themselves are so expensive for students to afford living in. I myself tried to apply for a unit in the Sydney University Village when I first started, but it was what, more than $500? I couldn't even remember, but it's really expensive. And this isn't even within the co-colleges. I wonder how much that costs. And so the universities wouldn't provide an affordable housing system for students. I don't think so. But one thing I wanted to say about was that I have friends who live in university villages in purpose-built housing. And one interesting thing that I know about when they share their stories that they found that inspections have now been used as a weapon against them. There are monthly inspections apparently of their units, but apparently in university villages, especially out there and outside of the city, apparently the landlords can just pop up at any time to inspect. And don't get me wrong, right? Students can leave a mess, but these students have now resorted to a manic sort of cleaning every week, just so they wouldn't be kicked out of their accommodation.
Right, and that's in purpose-built student accommodation.
Yes.
Right.
Just to add on to that, I completely agree with that because I'm living in one at the moment, and there are inspections, not every month, but every 6 months. There are inspections, and the property manager actually waltzes around the room and sees if everything is fine, if anything has been damaged. And there's also cleaning. So whenever, anyone comes in to clean the building, they have a look in the room as well. Just checking if the room is very untidy, they're going to charge you extra money. So yeah, and it's a part of my lease as well that you need to maintain your room. If anything gets broken, money might be deducted from your bond, or you might be kicked out as well.
The student accommodation I was talking about, thank you, Ashika. They've resorted to not actually cooking in their units because they don't want to make a mess.
I just would like to add to your question, Nicole, that I think that it should be some responsibility from universities, particularly to provide housing accommodation, tiny flats for international students, affordable and decent. Particularly those universities charging high fees to international students. As international students, we pay more than double than locals. And not just in expensive public universities, but also TAFE and the college which are providing general English courses and vocational training. They should have some level of responsibility. We are not just fee payers or providers. We should also be seen as people who deserve affordable and decent housing accommodation.
I'm mindful of time, but
Yeah.
I just have one last question I'd like to ask the three of you, and that is about the availability of support services for international students, but also for migrants moving to Australia in terms of finding housing. Do you have any, comments or observations to share on the availability or otherwise of support services?
I think just as a student, especially as a prospective student, when I was coming to Australia and I was planning, there are a lot of agents in India that facilitate, getting accommodations here in Australia. But just as a student, I feel I would really appreciate if we have that kind of support from the universities instead of private agents, because they tend to sell certain places that are like pipe dreams, that are not that are too real to be too good to be real. And when you reach Australia, you see that, oh my God, it's not what I've been seeing in pictures. It's not the same. So I think that kind of support needs to be streamlined. We need streamlined support from the universities because we as students do not feel safe seeking such support in terms of our accommodations from private agents, especially because we know that they get commissions for each and every room that they get booked in a given accommodation. Same goes for university agents as well. That not exactly university agents, but like private agents that facilitate our degrees, like the degrees that we take, the courses that we take in Australia. They also do the same thing. They also, provide help with regards to accommodation. But then again, I feel we are not given the complete picture when we're dealing with those agents. And we need that complete picture from the university to feel safe enough to come here and, live in a place. A lot of times we're actually forced to stay in the place which we've decided to stay in before coming to Australia. As I mentioned, leases are not flexible and places are dingy, especially purpose-built student accommodations. And we're not able to get out of it. So just having that kind of support from the university is imperative. We need to streamline that kind of support where we are being able to see what an accommodation actually looks like, what are the perks, instead of just being sold those through infomercials in our home country.
Thank you, Ashrika.
Well, look, that was really interesting. Raf, Valentina, and Ashrika, you've really highlighted what I had written up, and Monica had looked over my shoulder.
Nicole.
Yeah, sorry, Nicole. You guys are not causing the problem. You're victims of the bigger problem. I mean, that's where it seems to be. And it's just, I was just thinking when you were talking about the vice chancellors, I wonder if we could write to the vice chancellors, the thing, what's it called, the peak organization, the AVCC or whatever it's called. Could we write to them and ask them to give us a breakdown as to the income they receive from students and how much profit they make from it? I'd be interested to know that, actually. So maybe that's...
Sorry, I could add to that request for information would be their data on the current housing arrangements of their students and the support services that they are providing to those students.
Yeah. So, that as I said, I thought that was really interesting. It's clear, I think, one of you said that, maybe you, Valentina, that you actually are making a contribution to society in Australia. And while you're making that contribution, like many people, not just students in the private rental market, you're vulnerable. You're in substandard accommodation, you're in housing insecurity. And you have got another issue because you come from overseas, you're subject to discrimination, you're being exploited in jobs, you've got no privacy because of the way the landlords can come in and look at you, you're being prejudiced in a whole range of areas. And here we have these three young people, assertive, smart, articulate, and you're having a problem in this system. Someone who are not as assertive, smart, and articulate as you, I don't know how they get on at all. So, I think the other issue that came, jumped out at me was when it was indicated that the New South Wales government now is looking at simply bringing students from rich families in and poor students are not getting a look in. This is another class issue that that we need to have a look at. And it might be worth if, we could maybe ask the New South Wales Minister for Education to explain why that would be happening as part of our commission. So paying 50% of your income for shared accommodation just sounds to me to be an absolute rip-off. One thing you can be sure is that students are not alone in these issues. All the evidence we've had here is that this is a common problem across the country, across all demographics, across all areas. And I am more and more convinced that this is a real class issue, that, working people, young people from working class families are not going to get a look in the future. I must say, I think Sydney Uni is obviously doing a great job with the way you three guys are able to come here and put your passionate and articulate arguments. So thanks very much for, bringing these issues to our attention. A couple of those issues I had not thought about until you had raised them. And don't be a victim. You're not. You should not be blamed, because you guys are victims as well. So might leave it at that. Thanks very much, every one of you.
Thank you.